My name is Mila, and I am 42 years old. The last Thanksgiving I spent with my family, Rati stood up at the table and asked everyone to help my sister because poor Mila has nothing. But Myrna still has a future. 18 relatives nodded. Hubert would not look at me. Myrna smiled into her wine. They wanted me to sell my coastal boatyard to save the golden child one more time. What they did not know was that I had already sold it days earlier for $65 million. I just waited for Harold to open his folder. Before I go any further, if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, take a second to like and subscribe so it can reach someone else who needs it tonight. And tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read them all. To understand the absolute silence that fell over that dining room, you have to understand the life I built far away from them. I live on a jagged stretch of the Oregon coast. The wind here tastes like heavy salt and crushed pine needles. For 15 years, my boatyard has been my entire world. To anyone driving past on the highway, it probably looks like a chaotic graveyard of rotting wood, rusted metal, and forgotten maritime ghosts. But to me, it was a sanctuary. To Rati, my mother, it was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my failure. She never missed a single opportunity to point out my faded, grease-stained marine coat. She would loudly sigh whenever I pulled up to family gatherings in my 1996 Ford Bronco. The paint on the hood was peeling off in large gray flakes. Rati would tell her country club friends that I lacked ambition, making sure her voice was just loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. Arguing cost a type of energy that I desperately needed to conserve for my work. I spent my days restoring old commercial fishing vessels, sanding down years of neglect and rot until I found the solid, beautiful oak underneath. It was honest, quiet labor. It made sense in a way that my family never did. The only person who ever seemed to truly understand the quiet magic of this place was Tina. She is Myrna's 8-year-old daughter. While Myrna was endlessly busy curating her perfect manufactured life on social media, Tina was usually pushed to the background, treated like a prop that had outlived its usefulness for the day. Whenever they visited the coast, Myrna would stay locked inside the expensive vacation rental, complaining about the damp, salty air ruining her hair. Tina would immediately sneak away and run down the dirt path to my yard. I still remember the first time she showed up in her oversized yellow rubber boots. She did not say a single word. She just walked over, picked up a spare block of sandpaper, and started working right beside me on the hull of an old skiff. For hours, there was only the rhythmic, peaceful sound of grit sliding against dry wood. Tina was a quiet child, carrying a heavy, nervous energy that no 8-year-old should ever have to shoulder. She was forced to wear matching beige linen outfits for online photos, only to be entirely ignored the second Myrna's camera was turned off. But down here at the yard, covered in fine sawdust and smelling strongly of marine varnish, Tina was allowed to just be a little girl. She did not have to pose. She did not have to perform for an invisible audience. I would hand her a steaming cup of hot cocoa, and we would sit on overturned plastic buckets side by side, watching the violent gray waves crash against the black cliffs. I promised myself very early on that I would always be a safe harbor for her. I did not care what Rati or Myrna thought of me. I only cared that Tina knew she had one place in the world where she was allowed to be messy, loud, and real. I thought my isolation was a permanent shield. The storm was rapidly approaching. While I was covered in grease and sawdust, my sister Myrna was busy building an empire out of thin air. She was the undisputed golden child of the family. Myrna had founded a lifestyle and wellness brand that she named Aura and Ash. If you looked at her social media pages, you would think she was a visionary genius. Her digital footprint was a carefully curated sea of cream fabrics, gold accents, and overpriced woven baskets that nobody actually needed. Rati treated Myrna less like a daughter and more like a celebrity. At every family dinner, Rati would hand out Myrna's glossy business cards to relatives, loudly praising her entrepreneurial spirit. Behind the scenes, the reality was starkly different. Aura and Ash was a hollow shell. Myrna rented an expensive, sunlit office space in the city center, hired a team of personal assistants she could not afford, and threw lavish launch parties for products that never actually made a profit. She was bleeding cash every single month, and the person quietly bandaging those massive financial wounds was Hubert, our father. Hubert was a retired financial advisor who had spent his entire career preaching fiscal responsibility. Yet when it came to Myrna, he was nothing more than a silent, exhausted puppet. He simply sat at the head of the table looking incredibly tired and signed whatever checks Rati and Myrna put in front of him. I watched this dynamic play out year after year. Myrna would announce a catastrophic business loss disguised as a strategic rebranding phase. Rati would aggressively defend her, demanding that the family support Myrna's grand vision. Hubert would retreat to his study, his shoulders slumped, and a few days later Myrna would miraculously have the funds to sign a lease on a new, bigger warehouse for her unsold inventory. They were trapped in a toxic cycle of delusion, funding a lifestyle that did not exist with money they were rapidly running out of. I kept my distance. I focused on the smell of welding smoke and the reliable hum of my heavy machinery. I assumed their financial reckless behavior would eventually catch up to them, but I genuinely believed it would only affect their own bank accounts. I vastly underestimated the depths of Hubert's desperation and Rati's terrifying obsession with maintaining their upper-class image. They would rather set the entire family on fire than admit that the golden child had failed. The illusion finally began to shatter on a very specific afternoon. It was Tuesday at 4:15 in the afternoon when the first real crack appeared in their perfect facade. I was underneath the hull of a commercial trawler wrestling with a stubborn, rusted bolt when my phone vibrated in the deep pocket of my overalls. I usually ignore calls while I am holding a wrench, but the caller ID made me stop immediately. It was a name that rarely appeared on my screen, unless something was fundamentally wrong. I wiped the dark grease from my hands using an old rag and answered the call. The silence on the line was heavy. The man on the other end of the line was Harold. He is my late grandfather's younger brother, my great-uncle, and a retired head accountant. Harold is a man of incredibly few words. He is pragmatic, observant, and never goes anywhere without a battered green thermos filled with black coffee. While the rest of the extended family bought into Rati's grand narratives and Myrna's glittering illusions, Harold just sat in the corner, sipping his coffee, watching the numbers. Before my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, he had quietly taken Harold aside. My grandfather had always sensed a dangerous weakness in Hubert when it came to money and status. His dying request to Harold was simple: keep a close eye on the family's foundational trust accounts, Mila Harold said. His voice was unusually tight, lacking its normal steady cadence. The coastal wind was howling outside my cabin, but I could hear the distinct sound of shuffling papers through the phone speaker. I need to ask you a few questions about your father. Has Hubert mentioned anything to you about a series of large sequential withdrawals? I leaned against the cold metal of the boat trailer. Hubert barely speaks to me unless he is asking me to move my truck so Myrna can park her luxury SUV in the shade. Why? What are you looking at Harold? Harold sighed a long, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of a decade. He explained that, because of his status as a secondary trustee on some of the older family accounts, he still received quarterly oversight statements. Usually, he just filed them away in a cabinet. But the envelope that had arrived in his mail that morning contained anomalies that a man with 40 years of accounting experience simply could not ignore. He described a pattern of highly unusual signatures. Money was being moved in rapid, frantic bursts. These were not the calculated strategic investments of a retired financial planner. These were the desperate, messy actions of a man trying to plug a massive sinking hole in the bottom of a boat. He is draining the reserves, Mila Harold said quietly. And he is doing it fast. He is pulling from places he swore he would never touch. I think Rati and Myrna have finally bled him completely dry. I stood there in the freezing Oregon wind, processing the magnitude of what he was implying. If Hubert was tapping into the restricted funds, it meant Myrna's beloved startup was not just failing. It meant it was a financial black hole that was actively devouring our family's entire legacy. Are you absolutely sure? I asked, my voice barely rising above the sound of the crashing waves. Numbers do not lie, Kid Harold replied firmly. People do. I am going to pull the full historical records, every single transaction from the last 36 months. But Mila, you need to be prepared. When this ship finally goes down, Rati is going to look for a life raft. I hung up the phone and looked out at the churning gray ocean. At that moment, I still did not know the horrific extent of Hubert's betrayal. I did not know how low he had stooped. The lie was incredibly deep. For 15 years, I had allowed Rati and Myrna to treat me like a lower-class citizen in my own family. When people hear this, they always ask the exact same question. Why did you stay quiet? Why did you let them disrespect you for so long without fighting back? The answer is not simple. It requires understanding a psychological trap called learned helplessness. It is a slow, invisible poison that infects you when you realize that your emotional needs will never, ever be met. Growing up, Rati proudly labeled me her easy child. She used to brag to her friends about it. She would say, "Mila never asks for anything. She never cries. I never have to worry about her." I thought that label was a badge of honor. I thought it meant she loved my strength. It took me 3 decades to realize it was not a compliment. It was a very strict assignment. Being the easy child meant that my role in the family ecosystem was to absorb neglect silently, so that all the resources, attention, and affection could be relentlessly funneled toward Myrna. I remember a specific afternoon when I was 11 years old. We were standing in the hallway of our old house, and a massive coastal rainstorm was raging outside. The seams on my bright yellow raincoat had completely torn open at the shoulder. I was soaking wet and shivering. I walked into the kitchen and asked Rati if we could go to the store to replace it. She did not even look up from her magazine. She waved her hand dismissively and said she was far too busy. Myrna needed a new, expensive velvet dress for a piano recital that was still 3 weeks away. That was an emergency. My freezing shoulders were not. Complaining would have achieved nothing. I quietly walked out to the garage, found a spool of thick, clear fishing line, and sat on the cold, concrete floor. I awkwardly sewed the thick vinyl shoulder of the raincoat shut myself. It was a jagged, ugly scar of a repair, but it kept the water out. Later that evening, Rati noticed the crude stitching. Instead of feeling guilty, she smiled a bright, relieved smile. She praised my independence, noting how I always handled things and made her life easier. That was the exact moment the invisible chain was locked around my neck. I internalized a deeply toxic lesson. My value to my family was directly tied to my lack of needs. If I needed nothing, I was tolerated. If I asked for help, I was a massive burden. Myrna was loved because she constantly demanded to be rescued. I was ignored because I learned how to rescue myself. So I built my life around asking for absolutely nothing. I took the insults. I wore the faded clothes. I drove the dying truck. I convinced myself that my silence was a heavy armor that made me invincible. I believed that by lowering my expectations to 0, they could never disappoint me or hurt me again. I survived by disappearing completely. The only reason my spirit did not entirely break under the weight of Rati's cold indifference was my grandfather. He was a rough, weathered man who had spent his youth working on commercial crabbing boats in the unforgiving Pacific waters. He smelled permanently of rich pipe, tobacco, old cedar wood, and diesel fuel. While Rati and Hubert were busy polishing their country club memberships and grooming Myrna to be a society star, my grandfather saw right through their polished, superficial nonsense. More importantly, he actually saw me. He did not look at me and see a convenient shadow. He saw a survivor. I remember the exact afternoon, August 12th, when he handed me my first set of real tools. I was 14 years old. He had called me out to the old drafty wooden shed behind his house. On the workbench sat a heavy dark green canvas bag. Inside were a set of professional-grade wrenches, a heavy steel hammer, and a beautifully balanced hand sander. He did not wrap them in wrapping paper. He just pushed the heavy bag across the dusty table toward me. He told me the world would try to convince me that my worth was based on how pretty I looked in a dress or how loudly I could complain to get attention. He commanded me not to listen. He said my worth was in my hands. It was in what I could build, what I could fix, and what I could withstand when the storm hit. He was the one who taught me how to read the complex grain of oak. He showed me how to listen to the distinct hum of an engine to diagnose a failing belt. He taught me that things looking completely broken and worthless to ordinary people can almost always be brought back to life if you have the extreme patience to do the grueling, unglamorous work. When I was with him, I was not the invisible spare daughter. I was an apprentice. I was valuable. When my grandfather's health finally began to fail him in his late 80s, the rest of the family treated him like a tedious medical burden. Myrna complained about the harsh smell of his hospital room. Rati constantly worried about how his medical bills might impact her inheritance. I was the one who sat by his bedside, holding his calloused, fragile hand, quietly describing the ocean tides to him when his eyes could no longer focus on the window. He knew exactly what Hubert and Rati were capable of. He knew that the second his heart stopped beating, they would swoop in like starving vultures to liquidate his assets and feed Myrna's endless greedy vanity. He knew they would cast me aside without a single second thought. Because of that absolute certainty, my grandfather did not just leave me a set of heavy steel tools. He left me a massive, unshakable fortress. He knew they would come. 10 years ago, before my grandfather's mind began to truly slip away into the fog of his illness, he had a few weeks of startling, razor-sharp clarity. During one of those lucid windows, he made a phone call. He did not call Rati. He did not call Hubert. He called me along with his personal attorney and a state-certified notary. We gathered in the small wood-paneled study of his house. The room smelled strongly of his signature pipe tobacco and old paper. He sat heavily in his leather armchair and officially transferred the entire deed of the coastal boatyard into my name. But my grandfather was a man who understood the ruthless nature of the people he was related to. He knew that the moment he was gone, Rati would try to rewrite history, and Myrna would demand whatever scraps of value she could find. So he insisted on taking an extra, highly unusual step. He had the attorney set up a small digital camera on a tripod in the corner of the study. On that video, with the notary witnessing every word, my grandfather looked directly into the lens. He stated the date, he stated his full name, and he stated, with absolute unwavering conviction, that he was gifting the commercial yard exclusively to me. He explicitly said he was doing this to protect the land from Hubert's weak spine and Rati's relentless greed. It was a brutal, honest assessment of his own family, recorded forever on a tiny memory card. I took the deed, the notarized paperwork, and that video file, and I locked them away in a heavy, fireproof safe hidden under the floorboards of my cabin. When my grandfather finally passed away a few months later, the family immediately scrambled to read the will. When they discovered that the supposedly worthless boatyard had already been quietly transferred to me, their reaction was incredibly revealing. They did not fight it. They did not hire lawyers. They were actually relieved. Myrna laughed out loud in the hallway after the reading. She told Rati that it was fitting that I inherited a rotting pile of debt and environmental hazards. Rati simply sighed and said the yard suited my total lack of ambition. To them, the boatyard was a filthy, expensive burden. They were thrilled to be free of the property taxes and the upkeep. They genuinely believed my grandfather had handed me an anchor that would drag me down to the bottom of the ocean. They looked at the rusted cranes and the decaying docks and saw absolute ruin. They were utterly blind to the deep water rights and the solid commercial zoning. They assumed I was buried under rotting wood. I was planting a seed. The next 15 years of my life were defined by the brutal, unforgiving Oregon coast winters. The wind off the Pacific Ocean does not just blow. It actively cuts through layers of clothing, settling deep into your bones. Every dollar the yard generated went directly back into the business. I bought heavy-duty welding equipment, commercial-grade marine epoxy, and stronger reinforced steel. Luxuries were non-existent. I lived like a woman who had absolutely nothing, because on paper, for a very long time, I nearly did. I wore the same heavy dark blue marine coat every single winter until the stitching on the left pocket completely gave out. Discarding it felt wasteful. I found a thick silver safety pin in a toolbox, pinned the pocket shut, and kept wearing it. I drove the same 1996 Ford Bronco. The driver's side door would painfully stick in the damp weather, and the heater only blew warm air if you hit the dashboard in a very specific spot above the radio. I ate cold canned soup sitting on the decks of half-finished trawlers at 2 in the morning. I learned how to weld perfectly straight seams. I learned how to aggressively negotiate with rough, cynical marine parts dealers who initially thought I was just a lost secretary. There were incredibly hard years. There was a winter when a massive storm surge ripped the roof off my secondary storage shed. I spent 4 freezing days rebuilding the truss structure completely alone because I could not afford to hire a local crew. I called Hubert once during that storm. I did not want money. I just wanted to hear a familiar voice while my hands were bleeding from the cold. Before I could even tell him about the roof, he asked if I had finally come to my senses and decided to declare bankruptcy. I simply said no. He sighed, muttered something about Myrna needing a ride to the airport, and hung up. To my family, my struggles settled the debate forever. My peeling truck was proof. My torn coat was proof. My calloused, grease-stained hands were undeniable proof. They looked at the physical toll the work took on me and confidently declared that I had thrown my life away in the mud. It never once occurred to them to actually look at the structural integrity of the vessels I was launching back into the water. It never occurred to them to check the rising property values of commercial waterfront land. I never asked them for a single dime. I never asked for a favor. Becoming incredibly proficient at handling my own disasters became second nature. I convinced myself that this intense, grinding isolation was a form of strength. I believed that by needing absolutely no one, I was safe. I poured my blood, my sweat, and my youth into the cold gravel of that yard. I traded my comfort for complete sovereignty. I bought my absolute freedom. While I was out in the freezing rain building my fortress of isolation, Tina was slowly shrinking inside her mother's glittering, suffocating prison. Myrna's startup aura and Ash was heavily dependent on projecting a flawless, aspirational lifestyle. Tina was not treated like a growing, complex human child. She was treated like a highly curated marketing accessory. Myrna would force her into stiff, uncomfortable linen dresses, arrange her perfectly against a cream-colored backdrop, and snap dozens of photos for social media. The second the camera clicked off, Myrna's warm maternal smile would instantly vanish. She would hand Tina over to a rotating cast of underpaid nannies or just banish her to a corner with an iPad so Myrna could network. Tina absorbed that toxic rejection quietly. By the time she was 7, she had developed a nervous habit of aggressively picking at her fingernails until they bled. But whenever Myrna's life became too chaotic, or whenever she needed to jet off to a vital wellness retreat, she would abruptly dump Tina at my boatyard. It was free childcare, and it kept the girl out of her immaculate house. The transformation in Tina, the second Myrna's luxury SUV pulled away, was always profound. The tension would physically drain from her small shoulders. She would immediately kick off whatever expensive leather shoes she had been forced to wear and slide her feet into a pair of oversized bright yellow rubber boots I kept by the cabin door. She befriended a scrappy, three-legged stray dog that hung around the docks, feeding him scraps of turkey meat from my fridge. One particular afternoon in late October, the rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets. We were inside the cabin, the wood stove radiating a dry, comfortable heat. Tina was sitting at my scarred wooden table with a box of cheap crayons. She did not say a word for almost 2 hours. When she finally stood up, she slid a piece of heavy construction paper across the table toward me. It was a drawing of the boatyard. It was messy and vibrant. There was my peeling Bronco, the three-legged dog, a massive blue ocean, and 2 stick figures standing side by side under a gray sky. Across the top, written in careful, uneven 8-year-old letters, were the words, "Aunt Mila's Safe Harbor." She looked up at me with those huge, solemn eyes, completely unguarded. She hugged me tightly around the waist, her small hands clutching my grease-stained shirt. Taking a magnet, I placed that drawing directly in the center of my refrigerator. I stared at it for a long time after she went to sleep on the sofa. Looking at those uneven letters, I made a quiet, unbreakable vow in the dark of my kitchen. I knew a storm was eventually going to tear my family apart, but I swore it then. The child would not pay. The collapse of an empire rarely happens overnight. It does not start with a sudden explosion. It begins with a slow, quiet rot from the inside out. If you knew how to look for the signs, the decay of Myrna's manufactured life and Radha's beloved social standing was glaringly obvious. I noticed it because fixing broken things trains you to spot structural stress long before the wood actually snaps. The subtle changes started in early autumn. I was at the family house for a mandatory Sunday dinner. Myrna spent the entire evening pacing aggressively in the gravel driveway, sharply whispering into her phone, her knuckles white as she gripped the device. When she finally came inside, her smile was rigid and deeply unnatural. Her credit card was loudly declined when she tried to pay for a minor online purchase at the table. She let out a high-pitched, frantic laugh and blamed it on a ridiculous banking glitch, but her eyes were terrified. Rati, who usually dominated every conversation with boasts about her stock portfolio, suddenly became incredibly vague whenever the national economy was mentioned. She started actively changing the subject to gardening if anyone brought up interest rates. But the most alarming signs came from Hubert. Hubert had always been a man defined by his prized possessions. Yet the heavy, antique grandfather clock that had stood in his oak-paneled study for 30 years quietly disappeared. A few weeks later, his collection of vintage silver-plated golf clubs was gone from the garage. When I casually asked him where the clock went, he looked away, his hands trembling slightly, and muttered that it was at the shop for repairs. It never came back. The tension in the house was suffocating. They were drowning, and instead of swimming to the surface, they were desperately trying to pretend they could breathe underwater. The debt from Aura and Ash was clearly crushing them, but the absolute worst sin in Rati's universe was looking poor, so they kept spending. Myrna leased a newer, larger luxury vehicle. Rati hosted an extravagant catering event for her book club. They were meticulously painting over mold, hoping the walls would hold up just one more season. Watching them from the outside, I sipped my water in silence. Offering help felt completely futile. We did not do honesty in our family. We only did performances. But sitting across from Hubert, watching his gray, exhausted face, I knew the structural integrity of their lies was rapidly failing. The bill for Myrna's golden life was finally coming due, and they had absolutely nothing left in the bank to cover it. The frantic scrambling was over. The rot was finally showing. The trigger for the final explosion did not come from my family. It came from a man named Dean Mercer. Dean was a senior acquisition broker for a massive, aggressive commercial development firm operating out of Seattle. The coastline of Oregon had been slowly gentrifying for years, and the developers had finally set their sights on my specific jagged stretch of the cliffs. They were quietly assembling land for a luxury, ultra-exclusive eco-resort, and my boatyard sat directly in the absolute center of their planned footprint. Dean called my cell phone 4 times before I finally answered. He did not waste time with small talk or false charm. He drove out to the boatyard in a pristine black sedan that looked completely absurd parked next to my rusted cranes. He laid a glossy, oversized topographical map across the hood of my bad truck. The harsh coastal wind kept trying to lift the edges while he pointed a heavy gold pen at the geometric outline of my property. He told me I was the keystone. He explained they had the parcels to the north and the south, but they could not build the marina access without my deep water zoning. I held the only piece they actually needed. He pulled a blank contract from his leather briefcase. He wrote a number on the bottom line with his gold pen and pushed the paper across the hood toward me. I had to physically grip the side of the truck to keep my balance. $65 million. For the rotting wood that Myrna had laughed at. For the greasy embarrassment that Rati despised. For the 15 years of frozen hands and torn coats and solitary winters. Immediate joy was entirely absent. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute terror. I knew exactly what would happen the second that number became public knowledge. In my family, I would instantly cease to be a human being and become a shared communal resource. Rati would immediately draft a plan for my money. Hubert would assume I would bail him out. Myrna would demand her fair share to save her failing brand. I would be emotionally tortured, guilt-tripped, and manipulated until I handed over my life's work to plug the massive hole they had dug for themselves. At 9 o'clock in the morning on a gray Tuesday, I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in downtown Portland. My hands shook violently as I initialed the final pages of the acquisition documents. The lawyers smiled and shook my hand. The massive sum of money moved into a secured private account. I made a silent, unbending decision right there in that sterile room. Telling no one became my primary objective. Not the parts dealers, not my neighbors, and absolutely not my family. I took the final closing documents, drove back to the coast, and locked them in the fireproof safe. I kept my mouth shut. The drive back to the coast from the lawyer's office in downtown Portland took exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes. I spent the entire journey gripping the cracked steering wheel of my 1996 Ford Bronco. The heater was acting up again, rattling violently behind the dashboard and blowing completely cold air into the cabin. I had to strike the plastic panel above the radio 3 times with the heel of my hand before a faint trickle of warmth finally sputtered out. It was a familiar, frustrating ritual, but for the first time in 15 years, the broken heater and the peeling paint felt irrelevant. Inside the heavy canvas duffel bag resting on the passenger seat was a signed, legally binding contract that had just fundamentally altered the trajectory of my entire existence. I was a multi-millionaire. The sheer absurdity of that fact felt incredibly heavy. I kept doing the math over and over in my head, dividing $65 million by the cost of marine epoxy, by the price of heavy-duty welding wire, by the monthly grocery bills I used to carefully calculate down to the final cent. It was a number so vast that it completely lost its meaning. As I navigated the winding, rain-slicked highway toward the cliffs, I realized something profoundly sad. I had just achieved the kind of massive financial victory that most people only dream about. Yet there was not a single person in my family I could safely call to share the news. If I picked up the phone and dialed Rati, her voice would not fill with maternal pride. Her mind would instantly begin calculating how my sudden wealth could be immediately redirected to elevate Myrna's failing brand. If I called Hubert, he would clear his throat, awkwardly congratulate me, and then slowly pivot to asking for a temporary, undocumented loan to cover his hidden debts. That realization was a deep, solitary grief. But as I pulled into the muddy gravel driveway of my boatyard and turned off the rattling engine, that grief slowly began to curdle into something else. It turned into a strange, cold armor. Sitting in the silent cab of the truck, listening to the relentless Oregon wind battering the rusted metal siding of my workshop, I felt entirely alone, yet truly untouchable. My family had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to convince me that I was a failure because I did not possess their expensive, hollow aesthetic. They looked at my calloused hands and decided I was worthless. Now I held the ultimate proof that their judgment was utterly meaningless. Flaunting the money to prove them wrong was unnecessary. The quiet knowledge was enough. But that peaceful freedom was incredibly short-lived. I should have known better. In an ecosystem built entirely on lies, predators can always smell when the ground is starting to collapse beneath them. The vultures were finally circling. 3 days before Thanksgiving, the brutal coastal weather had settled into a steady, freezing drizzle. I was inside the main shed wearing my torn marine coat, carefully running a piece of sandpaper over the freshly sealed hull of a small wooden skiff. The rhythmic sound of the work usually drowned out everything else, but it could not drown out the aggressive crunch of heavy tires rolling over my gravel driveway. Setting my tools down, I walked to the large bay doors. 3 expensive, immaculately clean vehicles were parked in a jagged line right in front of my small cabin. Rati and Hubert stepped out of the first car. Myrna climbed out of the second. Myrna's husband remained sitting in the driver's seat of the third car, keeping the engine running, and his eyes fixed firmly on his phone. The fact that he refused to even step out into the rain told me absolutely everything I needed to know about how this visit was going to unfold. Knocking was never their style. They simply marched up the wooden steps and let themselves into my cabin. Wiping my hands on an old rag, I followed them inside. The small space immediately felt suffocatingly crowded. Rati stood near my small kitchen table looking around with poorly concealed disgust at my modest surroundings. She kept her expensive leather purse clutched tightly against her chest, as if she were afraid the poverty might be contagious. Myrna's eyes were bloodshot and heavily swollen, though she had clearly attempted to mask it with a thick layer of makeup. Hubert refused to look in my direction. He kept his gaze locked on a water stain near the baseboard, his shoulders completely slumped. Rati commanded me to sit down. She did not sound like a mother greeting her daughter. She sounded like a corporate manager preparing to issue a harsh directive to a low-level employee. She folded her manicured hands and rested them on my scarred wooden table. She announced that we needed to have a very serious conversation about the family, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. She claimed they were facing a slight headwind and needed everyone to pull their weight. Remaining standing near the doorway felt safer. I did not offer them coffee. Asking about their drive was pointless. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and watched the performance begin. Rati had clearly rehearsed this speech. It was the same manipulative cadence she used whenever she needed to rewrite reality to suit her needs. She was laying the groundwork for a massive demand, wrapping it in the sacred, untouchable language of family unity. I waited for the actual strike. Rati laid it all out with the calm, terrifying precision of a surgeon operating without anesthesia. According to her deeply sanitized version of events, Myrna's lifestyle brand, Aura and Ash, had merely hit a temporary rough patch. The housing market had supposedly fluctuated unpredictably, causing a slight issue with Hubert and Rati's mortgage. It was all framed as a series of unfortunate, unavoidable accidents. None of it was their fault. She told me that a real family comes together during hard times, staring at me with wide, incredibly earnest eyes. She insisted the most sensible, logical thing to do was for me to sell the Boatyard to help stabilize their accounts. Processing the sheer audacity of the request took a moment. Before I could even formulate a response, Myrna chimed in. Her voice was soft, trembling, explicitly designed to elicit maximum pity. Myrna pointed out that I did not have kids acting as if she were stating a simple mathematical fact. She reasoned that because I did not have much on the coast anyway, it made perfect sense for me to be the one to step up, praising me for always being the strong one. That was the sentence that finally knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. She did not say it with malice. She said it with absolute, terrifying sincerity. To Myrna, it was simply an undeniable truth of the universe. Mila has nothing of value, therefore Mila has nothing to lose. They were sitting at my kitchen table, casually asking me to completely liquidate the one single thing they believed I owned in this world, to throw away 15 years of my grueling labor, just to bail out the golden child one more time. I analyzed the three of them. Hubert still could not manage to lift his head and meet his daughter's eyes. Rati's gaze dismissively swept over my grease-stained boots and my patched coat, finding absolutely nothing there worthy of respect or protection. They honestly believed I was entirely broke. They believed I was trapped in this muddy yard with no options. And believing that, they had driven 3 hours in the freezing rain to demand that I strip myself down to the absolute studs and hand over the meager scraps. They wanted to take my entire livelihood and call it love. If they were willing to destroy me while they thought I had nothing, then this was never about fairness. It was never about genuine need. It was about the simple, brutal fact that I was a tool and Myrna was a person. Revealing the $65 million currently sitting in a secured account was unnecessary. I kept my voice perfectly level. "I will think about it," I said. They interpreted that as a guaranteed yes. Roddy's rigid shoulders instantly relaxed. Myrna managed a weak, relieved smile. They stood up, practically rushing to the door to escape the smell of my cabin. I watched them drive away. I stood on the damp wooden porch of my cabin long after their taillights had disappeared into the heavy coastal fog. The cold air seeped through my torn coat, but I barely registered the temperature. My mind was completely clear. For 42 years, I had quietly allowed them to define my worth. I had allowed them to treat my boundaries as minor inconveniences. But standing there in the freezing mist, listening to the aggressive roar of the Pacific Ocean, the final lingering thread of my familial guilt permanently snapped. They would have taken my absolute last dollar, left me with nothing but the clothes on my back, and genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. Reasoning with that level of deeply entrenched delusion was impossible. Defending myself was pointless. The only way to stop a machine that feeds on your emotional reactions is to completely unplug the power source. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I scrolled past the text from Rati, who had already messaged me to say how proud she was of my upcoming sacrifice, and dialed a different number. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I told Harold I needed him to come to the yard the next morning and to bring every single piece of paper he had found. "They made their move, didn't they?" Harold asked quietly. He did not sound surprised. He sounded deeply, profoundly sad. I confirmed they had asked me to sell the yard to save Myrna. Harold let out a long, heavy exhale over the line. "I will be there at 8. Have the coffee ready, Mila. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. If you have ever had your sacrifices weaponized by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever been told you are selfish simply for refusing to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, tell me below. You are not alone in that dark place. I spent the rest of the night meticulously organizing my own documents. I pulled the closing papers for the $65 million land sale from the heavy fireproof safe beneath the floorboards. I placed them in a neat clinical stack on the kitchen table. Then I pulled out the small digital memory card containing the video of my grandfather from 10 years ago. I set it right next to the contract. Sleep felt entirely unnecessary. I was preparing for a war they did not even know had been declared. When the sun finally began to break through the thick gray clouds the next morning, illuminating the rusted cranes and the dark water, I heard the familiar rumble of Harold's old sedan pulling into the driveway. I opened the door. He walked up the steps carrying his battered green thermos in one hand. In his other hand, he held a thick, dark red hardcover folder. He set it on the table. Harold and I sat in the cramped, cold space of my cabin. The rain continued to violently assault the tin roof, creating a deafening, chaotic soundtrack that contrasted sharply with the absolute stillness inside the room. Harold unscrewed the cap of his battered green thermos and poured a small amount of steaming black coffee into the plastic cup. He took a slow, deliberate sip before opening the heavy red hardcover folder, keeping his eyes locked on the thick stack of financial documents he had meticulously compiled over the past 48 hours. He refused to sugarcoat the situation. He told me he had spent 4 decades auditing businesses and managing wealth, seeing men make terrible, ruinous mistakes out of panic. But what Hubert had done was not a mistake. It was a systematic, desperate demolition. Sliding the first page across the scarred wooden table, he revealed a statement from the primary regional bank. The top line clearly indicated a home equity line of credit. The property pledged as collateral was the ancestral home, the sprawling historic estate that my grandfather had paid off completely free and clear 30 years ago. Hubert had quietly gone behind everyone's back and taken out a massive line of credit against it. The balance drawn was exactly $750,000. Staring at the numbers, a strange, heavy numbness spread through my chest. Tracing my finger over the stark black ink, I asked Harold how Hubert was paying for his own living expenses if the house was so heavily mortgaged. Harold slowly turned to the second page in the folder. He stated flatly that Hubert wasn't paying because he had emptied his retirement. The second set of documents were statements from Hubert's primary retirement and pension accounts. Going back roughly 2 years, there was a relentless, agonizing pattern of early withdrawals. He had pulled out roughly $450,000. Because he was withdrawing the funds years before he was legally allowed to touch them without consequence, every single transaction was stamped with a brutal, aggressive early withdrawal penalty. Hubert, the man who had spent 15 years lecturing me about fiscal responsibility, the man who called my boatyard a reckless gamble, had quietly set his own financial future on fire. Penalty by penalty, thousands of dollars lost to taxes and fees just to keep Myrna's glittering, fraudulent empire afloat for one more highly curated season. A total of $1.2 million had been completely vaporized. It had not gone into investments. It had not gone into a tangible, appreciating asset. It had been poured directly into a lifestyle brand that had never turned a single dollar of actual profit. It went to lease luxury vehicles, rent downtown office space, and fund extravagant launch parties. They had burned a massive generational fortune simply to avoid looking poor on the internet. Sitting there in the cold, I realized the absolute scale of their delusion. The numbers did not lie. Assuming the mortgaged house and the decimated retirement accounts were the absolute bottom of Hubert's betrayal was my final mistake. I genuinely believed that seeing $1.2 million completely evaporate into Myrna's vanity project was the worst damage he could possibly inflict. The specific kind of darkness that takes hold of a desperate man completely eradicates any remaining moral boundaries. Harold kept his large, weathered hand resting firmly on top of the stack, delaying the reveal of the final page in the red folder. Looking at me, I saw profound, unfiltered anger in his usually calm eyes for the first time since he walked into the cabin. He reminded me that my grandfather was a very smart man who knew Hubert was weak, but who also loved little Tina. The day she was born, he set up a dedicated 529 college savings plan. It was heavily restricted. The money was supposed to sit there, accumulating interest untouchable until she turned 18 and enrolled in a university. Lifting his hand, Harold slid the last document across the table. It was a final closing statement from the investment firm that managed the educational trust. The balance at the bottom of the page was exactly zero. He explained that Hubert, listed as the secondary custodian in case of my grandfather's passing, found a loophole. Citing extreme family financial hardship, Hubert forged a series of complex authorizations. He drained Tina's entire future. He took a child's education fund and handed it to Myrna so she could pay the overdue catering bill for a wellness retreat. My breathing stopped. The sound of the rain hitting the roof completely faded away. The carefully managed anger, the cold, distant frustration toward Rati and Myrna instantly mutated into something entirely different. Mortgaging a house is a foolish financial mistake. Draining a retirement account is an act of desperate ego. But stealing from an innocent 8-year-old child who currently sought refuge in my boatyard because her own mother ignored her, that was a fundamentally unforgivable crime. The image of Tina sitting on the overturned bucket drawing pictures of safe harbors while wearing her oversized yellow boots flashed in my mind. I thought of the way she picked at her fingernails when Myrna yelled at her. Hubert and Rati were willing to sacrifice Tina's entire future just to maintain Myrna's shallow plastic illusion. They had thrown the most vulnerable person in our family straight into the fire without a single second of hesitation. Carefully picking up the statement showing the empty college fund, I folded it neatly. Crying was not an option. The 15 years of forced compliance and silent endurance officially ended in that precise moment. My quiet isolation was no longer a defensive shield. It became a sharpened blade. The days immediately leading up to Thanksgiving were loud in the specific way that forced silence can be loud. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Rati sent a wave of deeply manipulative texts, each one carefully crafted to apply maximum emotional pressure. She claimed Myrna was crying herself to sleep every night, hoping I could live with that level of selfishness. Myrna sent long, dramatic voice notes detailing her hard work, the unfair economy, and how family meant unconditional loyalty. Hubert, true to his cowardly nature, sent absolutely nothing. Not one of them asked how I was doing. They only reminded me over and over of the massive debt I supposedly owed them. Replying to a single message felt useless. Taking screenshots of every text and saving every voice note was a much better strategy. I was learning that people quickest to demand unwavering loyalty will eagerly document their own toxic behavior if given enough silence. I spent those 3 days quietly preparing. After finalizing the timeline with Harold, I sent Rati a very short text message on Wednesday evening, confirming my attendance at Thanksgiving dinner. She replied within 2 minutes, her tone instantly pivoting back to suffocating artificial warmth. She was absolutely certain she had won, believing the easy child had finally broken under the pressure. Before we walk into that dining room together, I need to ask you something. What is the boundary you are absolutely terrified to set, but know you must? The one that keeps you awake at night? Tell me below. I am reading every single comment tonight because I know exactly how heavy that fear feels. On Thursday evening, I stood in my small cabin and prepared to leave. Dressing up for the occasion was not on my agenda. Pulling my faded jeans from the drawer, I put on my heavy dark blue marine coat, the exact same coat Rati had been mocking for over a decade. Checking the thick silver safety pin holding the left pocket closed, it felt profoundly right that the absolute destruction of their fake empire was going to be delivered from the pocket of the very coat they used to prove I was worthless. Taking the red hardcover folder Harold had given me, I carefully folded the banking statements and slid them into my inside pocket. Next to them, I placed the closing documents for the $65 million land sale. Stepping out into the freezing, damp Oregon air, I climbed into the driver's seat of my rusted Ford Bronco. The dashboard required 2 hits to get the heater running. Backing out of the muddy driveway, I merged onto the dark coastal highway. For 42 years, shrinking myself down to make them comfortable had been my default state. Tonight, the shrinking was permanently over. I walked through the door. Parking my rusted Ford Bronco at the very end of the long, perfectly manicured gravel driveway was my first deliberate move. The ancestral house looked exactly as it always did, a massive, imposing structure with tall windows glowing with warm golden light. Expensive vehicles lined the street. 18 relatives had gathered inside aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent the last 15 years actively nodding along to Rati's carefully constructed narratives about poor, unambitious Mila. Standing on the front steps, letting the freezing evening air hit my face, I listened to the loud, confident laughter echoing from the dining room. Pushing the heavy oak door open, the hallway smelled intensely of roasted turkey, expensive cinnamon candles, and old money. Walking into the main living room, wearing my patched marine coat, the conversations did not stop, but the tone visibly shifted. My aunt cast a quick, pitying glance at my boots. Rati immediately glided across the room wearing a tailored silk dress and placed her hand firmly on my arm. She loudly declared how incredibly glad she was that I decided to do the right thing and join them. Allowing her to touch my arm was part of the plan. Giving them one final hour of their comfortable manufactured reality ensured they would feel absolutely secure in their false victory. Walking around the room, I politely greeted cousins I had not spoken to since the last major holiday. Hubert stood near the fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, aggressively refusing to make eye contact with me. Myrna was holding court near the kitchen island. laughing a little too loudly, acting exactly like a wildly successful CEO who did not have a massive mountain of debt waiting to crush her on Monday morning. The only genuine moment occurred when I felt a small tug on my jeans. Looking down, I saw Tina. She was wearing an incredibly stiff, uncomfortable velvet dress that clearly itched her neck. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Reaching out silently, she wrapped her small arms around my leg, burying her face in the thick fabric of my coat. Kneeling down, ignoring Rati's disapproving sigh from across the room, I hugged her back tightly. The anxious, nervous energy vibrating in her tiny chest was palpable. Whispering softly into her hair, I promised her everything would be okay. Eventually, the massive dining table was set. Crystal glasses sparkled under the vintage chandelier. The silver was polished to a blinding shine. Taking our designated seats, the room filled with the sounds of clinking silverware and superficial chatter about golf tournaments and luxury vacations. Myrna smiled into her wine glass, radiating a smug, victorious energy. She believed the Boatyard was essentially hers to liquidate. She believed I was trapped. The trap was fully set. The heavy, uncomfortable tension in the room finally reached its breaking point just as the dessert plates were being cleared away. The superficial chatter slowly died down as Rati deliberately pushed her chair back and stood up at the head of the long oak table. Picking up a heavy silver fork, she gently tapped it against the rim of her crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound instantly commanded the attention of all 18 relatives in the room. Complete silence fell over the dining area. Smoothing the front of her expensive silk dress, Rati looked around the table with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. She began a long, carefully rehearsed speech about the immense value of family unity, emphasizing how, in a harsh and unforgiving world, blood is the only thing that truly matters. She spoke of resilience and sacrifice with the practiced ease of a politician. And then, exactly as she had planned, she turned her sharp, calculating gaze directly toward me. Her voice dripping with toxic, suffocating pity, Rati announced that we all know life takes us down different paths, and Mila had made her choices. She stated that poor Mila had nothing out on the coast but an old yard and a hard life. Placing a loving hand on Myrna's shoulder, she declared that Myrna still had a brilliant future, a company, and a vision. Therefore, it was time to come together and take care of Myrna, assuming I would step up and do the right thing for my sister. Raising her glass high into the air, Rati initiated a suffocating wave of collective judgment. 18 faces turned in unison to look directly at me. Some aunts offered a sad, tight-lipped smile. An uncle nodded slowly in agreement, clearly believing that sacrificing my entire livelihood was my natural duty. Hubert remained completely still, staring intensely at a small grease stain on the white linen tablecloth, refusing to intervene. Looking over the rim of her expensive wine glass, Myrna let a small, arrogant smirk play across her lips. She thought public shaming would force my compliance. At the far end of the table, little Tina looked wildly back and forth between her mother and me, her small hands gripping the edge of the wood. She did not understand why everyone was staring at me like I was a broken, useless machine they were about to sell for scrap metal. Breaking eye contact with Rati was not an option. Shifting uncomfortably in my chair was equally out of the question. Sitting there in the silence, I let the overwhelming weight of their collective arrogance fill the room. The cold, hard edges of the documents rested firmly against my ribs. I reached for my bag. Rising from my chair felt unnecessary. Rather than raising my voice or slamming my hands against the heavy oak table, I simply reached into the deep inside pocket of my faded marine coat and pulled out the thick, dark red hardcover folder that Harold had given me. Setting it gently on the pristine white linen tablecloth right next to my crystal water glass, the soft thud of the heavy cardboard echoed in the sudden, suffocating quiet. 18 pairs of eyes shifted from Rati's triumphant face down to the mysterious red folder. Looking directly across the length of the long table, I bypassed Rati entirely and locked my gaze onto the man staring at the grease stain. My voice completely level and calm. I asked Hubert if everyone sitting at the table knew that the ancestral house was currently heavily mortgaged. The room did not understand the implication right away, but Hubert certainly did. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes finally darted up to meet mine wide, with absolute, undeniable panic. Opening his mouth, no sound managed to escape. Trying to seize control of the narrative, Roddy snapped that it was entirely private, her voice much too sharp and far too fast. She insisted it was a financial matter between her and Hubert, completely unrelated to Myrna. Desperately attempting to sound like the calm, reasonable adult, Myrna jumped in. She called it a temporary restructuring and accused me of twisting things to avoid helping the family. Sitting quietly 2 seats down from me, Harold finally moved. Reaching over, he opened the red folder and pulled out the first page. Sliding it toward the center of the table, the light from the vintage chandelier fell perfectly on the bold black ink. Harold smoothly asked Myrna to explain the $750,000 home equity line of credit. A cousin's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. A heavy wooden chair creaked loudly in the silence. Harold laid the second page down, and then the third. He arranged them in a meticulous, undeniably devastating row across the white tablecloth. The home equity statements, the depleted retirement accounts showing roughly $450,000 pulled out early, stamped with brutal penalty fees. And finally, the educational trust documents, showing Tina's college fund completely drained to absolute zero. The silence spread across that dining room like thick, spilled paint. The relatives who had just turned to me with suffocating pity now turned to look at Rati, then at Hubert, and finally at Myrna. The pity completely vanished, replaced by something significantly colder and far more judgmental. They were looking at absolute financial ruin. The silence was absolutely deafening. Rushing to defend Rati was not on anyone's agenda. That detail remains the most vivid memory from that night. In a family that had spent over 3 decades aggressively defending Myrna and excusing Hubert's passive behavior, not a single person opened their mouth to offer comfort. Arguing with banking numbers printed in black ink is impossible. An older uncle, a man who had spent years at these exact holiday tables, calling me a stubborn disappointment, slowly reached out and picked up the home equity statement. Reading it carefully, he set it back down on the tablecloth like it had suddenly caught fire in his hands. Watching 15 years of carefully constructed lies completely unravel behind my uncle's eyes in the space of a single breath was fascinating. The exact same realization was happening all the way around the long table. The polished upper-class illusion was officially dead. Keeping my final statement incredibly short was essential. Solitary winters on the coast had taught me that the truth never needs to be shouted to cause maximum damage. It only needs to be spoken clearly by someone who is no longer afraid. Looking directly at Myrna, I stated plainly that they did not come to my boatyard because I had nothing. They came because they had already spent everything they had on her. Myrna finally broke. Surviving a silence that does not actively worship them is impossible for people like my sister. Her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure rage. The wine, the mounting fear, and a lifetime of being handed everything she ever wanted boiled over. Screaming loudly, her voice cracking violently, Myrna slammed her hands flat against the table. She yelled that the money should be the family's anyway, claiming she deserved the property more than a pile of rotting wood, and explicitly stated that I owed her. At the far end of the table, little Tina squeezed her eyes shut and clamped both of her small hands tightly over her ears. My uncle stood all the way up and took a disgusted step back from his chair. Rati buried her face in her hands. Hubert just stared blankly at the wall. Myrna had just publicly confessed to her own unbearable greed. Reaching into my torn pocket one last time, I pulled out the thick stack of acquisition documents from the Portland lawyers. Waving them around like a trophy was beneath me. Simply placing them face down on the table right next to the bank statements was entirely sufficient. Quietly, I announced that I had sold the yard last week for $65 million, adding that I had told no one and that none of the money belonged to them. Waiting for their reaction was unnecessary. Standing up, I walked around the massive table to where Tina sat and gently kissed the top of her head. Promising I would see her soon, I turned around and walked out of the house my grandfather built. I walked out the door. Spending the weekend back at the coast, I listened to the heavy rain and enjoyed a profound, uninterrupted silence. Genuinely thinking the war was over, I assumed the sheer overwhelming humiliation at the Thanksgiving table would force Rati and Myrna into a permanent, embarrassed retreat, fundamentally underestimating the reckless desperation of people who have absolutely nothing left to lose was a miscalculation. On Monday morning, just after 8 o'clock, a process server pulled into my muddy driveway and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Myrna and her husband had aggressively hired a notoriously ruthless litigation attorney from Portland. Officially filing a motion for an emergency injunction, their goal was to completely freeze the $65 million sitting in my accounts. The official legal claim was both absurd and deeply insulting. Formally accusing me of manipulating my grandfather 10 years ago, they claimed he was not of sound mind when he transferred the deed of the Boatyard to my name. Alleging elder abuse and fraudulent coercion was their final play. They wanted to drag me into a brutal, drawn-out legal battle, hoping the mounting legal fees and the stress would eventually force me to offer them a multi-million-dollar settlement just to make them go away. Panicking was not an option. Calling Hubert to scream at him felt completely useless. Picking up my phone, I simply called Harold. We drove to the county courthouse together on Wednesday afternoon for the preliminary emergency hearing. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, Myrna and her husband looked incredibly smug and confident. Their aggressive lawyer stood up and delivered a passionate, completely fabricated speech about a vulnerable old man being taken advantage of by his isolated, desperate granddaughter. When it was our turn, my attorney declined to argue verbally. Approaching the judge's bench, he simply handed over a small digital memory card. The court clerk loaded the file, and the video from 10 years ago projected onto the large screen in the room. My grandfather sat in his wood-paneled study. His voice was loud, sharp, and unmistakably clear. Looking directly into the camera lens, he explicitly stated that he was transferring the property to me specifically because Hubert was weak and Rati was greedy. Naming them both, he stated his exact intentions with the unwavering clarity of a completely sane man. The state-certified notary appeared on screen, confirming his mental capacity. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Staring at the screen, Myrna's aggressive lawyer's face turned a distinct shade of pale gray. Looking down at his files, then back up at the frozen image of my fierce grandfather, he quietly began packing his expensive leather briefcase. Mumbling to the judge without looking at Myrna, the lawyer formally withdrew the motion. The case was immediately dismissed. The consequences of the Thanksgiving disaster arrived exactly as they always do. They trickled in slowly at first, and then all at once in ways that absolutely no one could rewind or undo. Without the constant enabling flow of Hubert's stolen money, the glittering facade of Myrna's life collapsed with terrifying speed. Shortly after the new year began, the severe financial reality set in. The bank formally initiated foreclosure proceedings on Myrna's massive cream-colored house in the suburbs. The tall, pristine windows went completely dark. Bolted to the front door where her elaborate seasonal wreaths used to hang was a sterile metal lockbox. Aura and Ash, the lifestyle brand that had devoured over $1 million of our family's wealth, abruptly ceased operations. The website simply vanished overnight. Realizing there was no hidden fortune left to salvage, Myrna's husband aggressively filed for divorce. The last update I heard through the family grapevine was that they were locked in a vicious, highly public legal battle over who owed exactly what to various angry creditors. Hubert and Rati finally had to face the horrific nightmare they had been running from for nearly 3 years. The massive monthly payments on the $750,000 home equity loan came due, and they had absolutely zero income to cover the enormous checks. The retirement accounts were gone. The savings were gone. Perhaps most devastatingly for Rati, the entire extended family now knew in exact printed detail exactly how everything had been destroyed. The relatives who had spent 15 years casually passing around the tired narrative of poor, foolish, unambitious Mila completely stopped telling that story. It died overnight. In the weeks following the holidays, a few aunts and cousins awkwardly called me. Offering hesitant, uncomfortable apologies, they swore they had no idea how bad things truly were. They claimed they never would have pressured me at the table if they had known about Tina's stolen college fund. Keeping those phone calls incredibly short was easy. Listening politely, I did not offer them the warm comfort they were seeking. Handing out easy absolution that I did not genuinely feel just to alleviate their lingering guilt was not going to happen. They had comfortably watched me be treated like a second-class citizen for decades because it was easier than confronting Rati. Wishing them harm was not in my nature, but inviting them into my new life was out of the question. Letting the dust completely settle took a few quiet months. I owed them nothing. For the first time in my 42 years on this earth, I allowed myself to feel the full, beautiful, strange weight of that word. Nothing. No financial debt, no emotional obligation, no forced attendance at holiday dinners. I owed them absolutely nothing. In late spring, a large, aggressive wooden sign went up in the front yard of the historic ancestral house. It read, "Public Bank Auction." When Harold sent me a photograph of the sign, I sat on the porch of my cabin and stared at the image for a long time. Realizing with a heavy heart that I simply could not let it happen was difficult. Doing it to save Rati's precious social status was out of the question, and rewarding Hubert's profound cowardice was never the goal. I was doing it solely for my grandfather. Allowing the house he had built and loved to be sold off in pieces to strangers just to cover the debts of a deeply ungrateful generation was unacceptable. Calling my estate attorney in Portland, I executed the final phase of my quiet plan. Attending the bank auction through a proxy, I purchased the entire property using clean, untraceable cash. Simply handing the deed back to my parents was never going to happen. I utilized a specific, highly restrictive legal mechanism known as an irrevocable trust. Understanding the absolute terrifying permanence of this legal structure is crucial. When real estate is placed into an irrevocable trust, it effectively ceases to belong to any individual person. It belongs exclusively to the trust itself. Once the ink dries on the documents, the terms cannot be altered, amended, or reversed by anyone, not even the person who created it. Drafting the trust involved excruciatingly precise conditions. Hubert and Rati were legally permitted to reside in the house for the remainder of their natural lives. Eviction was off the table. However, they owned absolutely zero equity in the structure. Because the property belonged to the trust, Hubert could never, under any circumstances, use the house as collateral again. Pledging it was impossible. Taking out a loan against the roof was prohibited. No creditor from Myrna's spectacular bankruptcy could ever place a lien on the front door. The house was a perfectly secure vault, completely immune to their toxic financial habits. Driving up to the city, I walked into their small, temporary rented apartment and set the heavy brass keys down on the cheap kitchen counter right in front of them. Looking at Hubert's exhausted face, I calmly told them they could live in his house without ever worrying about a roof over their heads. But I made it explicitly clear that they did not own it, and it would never ever be used as leverage for Myrna again. It was a profound act of filial piety that simultaneously stripped them of all their power. They were safe, but permanently contained. It was the perfect cage. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, on a beautifully clear Friday in late June. Standing on the newly polished teak deck of a commercial fishing vessel that I had spent the last 4 months painstakingly restoring by hand, I felt the ocean breeze. The boat was currently docked at a private, secure marina on a massive 100-acre parcel of coastal land that I had purchased earlier that spring, completely isolated from the main highway. It was surrounded entirely by ancient towering pine trees and steep, black, rocky cliffs. Aggressive commercial developers were nowhere to be found. The traffic noise was entirely absent. The rhythmic, soothing crash of the Pacific Ocean against the jagged rocks below was the only sound. Buying a massive mansion or an absurdly expensive luxury car with my $65 million held no appeal. Purchasing a much quieter, profoundly peaceful life was the ultimate goal. I kept my heavy dark blue marine coat with the thick silver safety pin holding the left pocket together, though I did finally buy a newer truck with a cabin heater that worked perfectly on the very first try. Sitting in a sturdy canvas deck chair just a few feet away, Harold unscrewed the cap of his familiar battered green thermos. Pouring 2 steaming cups of black coffee, he handed one to me without saying a word. We stood there side by side looking out over the dark water, letting the heavy, comforting silence wrap around us. He remains the only person from my extended family who has absolutely unfiltered access to my life, precisely because he never once asked me for a single dollar or a single favor. Finalizing one more piece of crucial legal paperwork that afternoon was necessary. Using the exact same meticulous estate attorney who drafted the irrevocable trust for the ancestral house, I quietly established the Tina Maritime Preservation Fund. It is a massive, heavily endowed educational foundation designed to teach vulnerable, at-risk youths the highly skilled trades of boat building and marine restoration. More importantly, it is structured so that when Tina turns 18, she will immediately step into a fully funded, salaried directorial role on the board. Bypassing whatever financial ruin Myrna has inevitably dragged her into by then is guaranteed. Tina does not know about the massive fund yet. Knowing is unnecessary for now. Carrying that heavy, beautiful secret is a burden I am more than happy to shoulder. Sometimes on quiet weekends, she still comes out to the new yard in her bright yellow boots, feeding the stray dogs and chattering happily about the seagulls. She is completely safe. Breathing in the deep, sharp scent of salt water and fresh varnish, I reflected on my past. For decades, my entire existence was defined by making myself as small and as invisible as humanly possible so that Rati and Myrna could comfortably take up all the oxygen in the room. Anticipating their manufactured crises, absorbing their subtle insults, and carrying the exhausting weight of being the family's designated failure had consumed my youth. Standing on that wooden deck, the heavy, suffocating pressure in my chest was completely gone. Being the strong one for anyone anymore was no longer my assigned role. No one was keeping a toxic, one-sided ledger. The clean air out here was the absolute plainest, most beautiful thing in the world. I was finally breathing. Here is the ultimate profound truth that it took me 42 years and $65 million to finally understand. Your inherent worth as a human being is never defined by your bank account. It is certainly never defined by how useful you can be to people who only ever reach for your hand when they are rapidly falling. Rati and Hubert spent over 3 decades carefully dictating what my life was worth to the rest of the family. And then they had the absolute audacity to ask me to prove my loyalty by setting myself on fire to keep Myrna warm. The complete silence I maintained that winter, while the acquisition lawyers drafted the massive land sale, was never a malicious trick. Cruel, petty revenge was not the objective. It was simply the very first time in my entire existence that I actively, consciously chose to protect myself. Growing up as the designated outcast conditions you to believe that enduring emotional abuse is a mandatory toll you have to pay just to remain in the family. You become a human toll booth, constantly paying out your own peace of mind to facilitate their toxic journeys. Telling yourself that tolerating the disrespect is a noble form of resilience is a lie. It is a slow, quiet surrender. True legacy is not the money or the property you inherit from your ancestors. True legacy is the peace you desperately fight to protect and the generational trauma you actively refuse to pass down. Walking away from the people who share your DNA is often the heaviest, most agonizing decision you will ever make. It occasionally aches on holidays. Stinging when you see other families functioning normally is a reality. Setting a firm boundary does not magically stop it from hurting. But underneath that dull ache, for the first time in my life, there is an incredible, vast expanse of clean air. Cutting off contact with toxic blood relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary, vital act of survival. You absolutely do not have an obligation to fund the delusions of people who view your genuine sacrifices as their inherent birthright. Loving them from a distance or stopping loving them entirely are both completely valid choices. I am no longer anyone's insurance policy. My grandfather's old heavy steel tools are currently hanging on the wall of my new workshop. The crayon drawing Tina made of my safe harbor is securely fastened to my new stainless steel refrigerator. There are always 2 clean coffee cups resting on the counter waiting for whenever Harold decides to stop by. Rati and Myrna spent my entire life loudly deciding what my narrative would be. I spent one quiet winter deciding that the pen was never actually theirs to hold. If you have ever had to stop making yourself incredibly small just to keep the peace with people who are supposed to unconditionally love you, I genuinely hope tonight you feel a little less alone in the dark. What is the boundary you are still working up the courage to set? I am listening. I read every single one. The pen is yours.